modern art, watercolor probably isn't the first medium that comes to mind. We think of Picasso's fractured figures, Mondrian's black grids, Pollock's explosive drips, Kandinsky's floating shapes and brilliant colors, and Chagall's dreamlike lovers, animals and flying musicians. But all five of these artists also worked on paper using watercolor, or watercolor combined with another medium. What's fascinating about watercolor compared to oil paint is that it behaves differently, dries quickly. It's transparent. It allows the white of the paper to become part of the color. And perhaps most importantly, it forces the artist to accept a certain amount of unpredictability. So what happened when these radically different modern artists picked up a brush loaded with water? The answer tells us something surprising about their art. Let's start with Pablo Picasso. Picasso constantly changed styles and experimented with almost every medium imaginable. Watercolor was one of those tools. His watercolor The Mill at Horta from 1909 is particularly revealing because it belongs to the period when Picasso was developing the ideas that would become Cubism. Instead of building a figure or landscape with thick layers of paint, he establishes a shape with a few transparent strokes. The paper remains visible. Color is placed next to color without completely covering the drawing underneath. It's as if Picasso is still thinking through the problem in front of him. That's important because Picasso's watercolors weren't always finished paintings. Some functioned as laboratories for ideas. Watercolor therefore suited Picasso's experimental mind. He could draw, change, simplify, add color, or leave something unfinished. In his 1909 Sugar Bowl and Fan, the watercolor's apparently unfinished passages help emphasize the faceted planes associated with his early Cubist style. Watercolor made Picasso's paintings more analytical. The transparency of the medium also exposed the construction underneath. It's like we're watching Picasso build the image. For him, watercolor was not just about beautiful washes. It was a way of thinking with a brush. Today, Piet Mondrian is synonymous with abstraction. Black horizontal and vertical lines, white spaces, red, yellow, and blue rectangles. But before Mondrian became the famous abstract artist, he was a landscape painter. And watercolor played an important role in that journey. Here's Amstel River from 1907, a watercolor and charcoal drawing on paper. At this stage in his artistic career, Mondrian is looking at the natural world. Trees, water, sky, architecture. But even here something is happening. He's simplifying what he sees. He doesn't describe every leaf, branch, or ripple. With watercolor, he reduces the landscape to large areas of tone and color. And that's one of the great strengths of watercolor. A few dark strokes become a tree. A patch of color suggests water reflecting light. Mondrian's later abstraction would take this process of reduction much further. Eventually, the tree is a vertical line. The horizon is a horizontal line. Natural color is an organized system of primary colors. But there's an interesting connection between his early watercolors and his mature paintings. Watercolor taught him that a powerful image leaves things out. The blank paper matters. The space between shapes matters. A few carefully placed marks organize an entire composition. So when you look at a mature Mondrian and see a seemingly simple grid, remember the watercolor landscape underneath it. The abstraction didn't appear out of nowhere. It grew out of years of looking, simplifying, and reducing. Watercolor was perfectly suited to that process. Now we come to Jackson Pollock. Pollock is famous for his poured and dripped enamel paintings, not watercolor. But he did make important works on paper using watercolor, gouache, and ink. The painting Untitled from 1944 combines watercolor, gouache, and ink. Pollock used transparent watercolor alongside black gouache, the opaque form of watercolor, to create a striking interaction between light and dark. That combination tells us something about Pollock. He wasn't interested in watercolor because it was delicate. He was interested in what the medium could do with a mark. A line is drawn, a wash is spread, a transparent color sits underneath an opaque one, ink cuts across the surface. All of these marks could coexist. In Untitled Animals and Figures, Pollock combined gouache and ink, layering vibrant lines over loosely drawn figures and animals. He continued developing, fusing different layers together. In his drip paintings, Pollock's technique wasn't simply throwing paint around. It was about creating a surface where different kinds of marks interact. Line, splash, drip, gesture, density, transparency, opacity. His early work on paper shows him experimenting with that visual language before the monumental drip paintings took over. Pollock's works on paper help us see the connection between drawing and painting in his art. The mark itself becomes the subject. If any artist seems naturally suited to watercolor, it's Wassily Kandinsky. Kandinsky believed painting communicates something beyond the visible world. He wanted color and form to express emotions, sensations, and inner experience. Watercolor gave him a direct way to explore those ideas. In 1914, he created improvisation, a watercolor and pencil work on paper. Kandinsky used musical language to describe his art. And watercolor has something in common with musical improvisation. It moves quickly. The stroke is spontaneous. Colors bleed into one another. A line responds to what happened a moment before. The artist reacts to the movement of the paint itself. Kandinsky was deeply interested in controlling relationships between color, shape, and movement. In his earlier works, we still recognize traces of landscapes and figures. Recognizable objects dissolve. Lines become independent. Circles, triangles, patches of color, and energetic marks occupy the paper on their own. Watercolor's transparency becomes part of this visual language. Color doesn't simply sit on top of the paper. It seems to float within it. In Kandinsky's later watercolors, he combined transparent watercolor with gouache, contrasting glowing transparent passages with more solid shapes. For Kandinsky, watercolor wasn't merely a preparatory medium. It became a language of color, rhythm, transparency, and movement. Marc Chagall's paintings seem to exist somewhere between memory and dream. People float. Animals appear in impossible places. Musicians hover above villages. Lovers embrace in the sky. Color carries emotional meaning. Watercolor was particularly suited for this kind of visual world. Chagall made watercolors as independent works, but he also used watercolor, gouache, and pencil for designs connected with theater and ballet. Chagall's imagination needed color that could be both luminous and expressive, but also flexible enough to work on paper. Watercolor produced transparent washes. Gouache created opacity. Pencil generated lines. Together, they allowed him movement between drawing and painting. That combination fits Chagall's imagery beautifully. His figures are solid one moment and almost weightless the next. A blue wash becomes night. A red shape becomes emotion. A few loose marks suggest an entire village. Watercolor preserves that sense of immediacy. You can sense the paper in the hand, and that makes the dream feel strangely intimate, as though you're looking at a memory before it has fully solidified. So why did they use watercolor? The answer is that each artist found something different in it. For Picasso, watercolor enabled experimentation, a quick way to test structure, color, and form. For Mondrian, watercolor simplified the natural world, turning observation into economical arrangements of shape and color. For Pollock, watercolor allowed experimenting with gesture, layering, transparency, and the expressive power of the mark. For Kandinsky, watercolor offered spontaneity and luminous color, perfect for his attempt to make painting behave like music. And for Chagall, watercolor preserved the fluid, intimate, dreamlike quality of his imagery. We talk about artists as though style comes entirely from their imagination. But style also comes from materials. The paint and surface changes the artist. Watercolor behaves differently from other media. It spreads, stains, and reveals the paper. It asks the artist to make decisions quickly. Watercolor encourages qualities important to modern art, such as simplicity, spontaneity, transparency, experimentation, and the visible gesture. That's why these artists' watercolors are worth looking at. Not because they are miniature versions of their famous paintings, but because they reveal another side of the artist's thinking. That's the real magic of watercolor. It doesn't just add color to an idea, it changes the way the idea exists. Remember, the medium is part of the message.